All right, so we're diving into something today that's been like everywhere lately, transgender athletes in women's sports.
Yeah,
It's been a hot topic.
it's been everywhere.
And specifically, we're going to be looking at the Leah Thomas case,
Right.
and like the crazy Senate hearing that happened because of that.
Hmm.
So we've got excerpts from the hearing transcript. You're going to hear from Senators Riley Gaines, who's a former NCAA swimmer who competed against Leah Thomas,
Oh, wow.
and Chris Mosier, who's an advocate for transgender athletes. So it's like
Okay.
you're right there in the middle of this crazy debate.
What's so fascinating about this whole case is it's not just about sports. Like, it raises these huge questions about gender, about fairness, how we even define what it means to be, male or female.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And to kick things off, we're starting with Riley Gaines's testimony. Her experience at the 2022 NCAA championships, where she tied with Leah Thomas, is like crazy. It's like such a good place to start.
So this is where things get really interesting, right? So picture this. Gaines ties with Thomas in the 200-yard freestyle, and then she's told she has to give up the trophy for pictures because Leah has to have it for pictures.
Oh my gosh. I mean, that must have been, I can only imagine how she felt in that moment. It's like such a
Yeah.
tangible example of this whole debate and these issues surrounding transgender athletes in women's sports, at least from her perspective.
Hmm.
And she goes on to argue, that men and women have these clear biological differences that just can't be ignored, and that these differences can give men a natural advantage, especially in athletics, right?
Right. And she makes this really interesting point about how, like, men, on average, have a 40% larger throat. No. And you think, okay, what does that mean? But then she explains how that impacts lung capacity, which is, like, crucial for swimming, right? So it's like this really interesting scientific point that she brings into it.
Absolutely. And you can hear in her words, like the emotion as she's talking about, watching female athletes lose these opportunities, potentially because of transgender athletes competing in women's sports.
Yeah.
It really adds like another layer to this already really complex issue.
Yeah. Now, on the other side of the debate, you have Chris Mosier, who is a strong advocate for transgender athletes.
Right.
And the senators, especially Ted Cruz and John Kennedy, really grilled Mosier about, defining the differences between men and women. And you can, like, feel this tension building in these exchanges.
It's so interesting how Mosier handles these questions.
Hmm.
They assert that there's more than just two sexes. They bring up like intersex people.
Right.
But the senators seem to be like working with a much more like traditional understanding of sex. You can almost see like the confusion.
Yeah, it's like they're speaking two different languages almost.
Yeah.
Senators are pushing for these, like, black and white answers, and Mosier is emphasizing, like, the complexity and the fluidity of gender.
Yeah.
And when they're asked directly, like, do males have a biological advantage in sports, they don't give a straight answer.
Right. And this is where I think the heart of the conflict really lies. You've got folks like Gaines who are arguing that biological sex is like everything in sports.
Right.
And allowing trans women to compete in women's sports is creating this uneven playing field.
Right. And then you have, on the other hand, people who are focused on this idea of inclusivity and the right of transgender people to compete based on their gender identity, not their biological sex.
Right. Yeah. So two totally different viewpoints.
Yeah.
And it plays out like so vividly in this hearing. Senator Marsha Blackburn, for example, has this like really powerful statement about what she calls the radical Democrat agenda to destroy girls' sports and women's sports.
And to back that up, they actually entered a Duke Law article into the official record, like this article that compares the top athletic records of women with those of boys and men. So, like, clearly trying to demonstrate, like, the physical advantage.
Wow. Okay, so we're talking about the rights of transgender individuals. We're talking about the fairness of competition in women's sports. And
Right.
they're talking about this like evolving understanding of what gender even means. It's all tangled up together.
Yeah, it really is. It's like a tangled web.
Yeah.
We're trying to balance, individual rights with fairness, scientific data with these evolving social constructs. And the hearing itself doesn't, like, give us any simple solutions.
Yeah.
It just, like, shows us these, these deep disagreements.
Yeah, so we have Riley Gaines sharing her experience and her worries about fairness, and Chris Mosier arguing for the inclusion of trans athletes and emphasizing the shifting understanding of gender. What I thought was really interesting is the way Senators Cruz and Kennedy approached their questioning of Mosier. It seemed like they were really trying to, like, poke holes in the argument, you know what I mean?
Oh, for sure. Their line of questioning is really interesting. They kept pushing Mosier to give these like yes or no answers about the difference between men and women,
Right.
which, kind of oversimplifies things.
Right. It was almost like they were trying to like make it black and white.
Yeah,
You know,
totally.
and Mosier kept pushing back, being like, it's way more complicated than that.
Yeah, and then there was that whole exchange about the number of genders, where Mosier explains that it's this evolving concept.
Yeah.
And then Kennedy jumps in and he's like, so there's an infinite number of genders. Like, he's almost trying to make Mosier sound absurd.
Yeah.
But for Mosier, it's just, you know, reflecting the reality of human identity, which isn't always so neatly defined.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of funny, but also it's like scary because you see how totally different their viewpoints are. Like that kind of breakdown in communication makes it really hard to find common ground.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And I think maybe the most revealing part comes when Kennedy asks Mosier, like straight up about biological males having a physical advantage over biological females in sports.
Right.
And Mosier hesitates,
Uh-huh.
avoids giving a direct answer.
Yes.
It was very telling.
They were like, I'm not a physician.
Yeah.
Trying to like deflect it.
Right, right. But Kennedy doesn't let up. He presses from Mosier's personal experience.
Right.
And then Mosier talks about their husband, who is also a swimmer.
Mm-hmm.
And they say he could kick my butt any day of the week without trying.
Right. And that's when Kennedy like lays into Mosier, being like, I think you lose a lot of credibility when you don't concede that a biological male has physical advantages over a biological female. I just think that's a proven fact.
Yeah, he even says that Mosier is like undermining their own credibility by not acknowledging this proven fact. It's like such a strong statement, and it really gets to the, the heart of the disagreement.
It really boils down to these two totally different ideas.
Mm-hmm.
One side is saying that biology is destiny.
Right.
Men are stronger and faster, period. And the other side is saying that gender identity trumps biology, and trans women should have the right to compete in women's sports without being forced to conform to these traditional ideas about biological sex.
Mm-hmm. It's like we're at this crossroads, trying to figure out how to balance these two ideas.
Right.
Do we prioritize biological differences? Do we prioritize inclusivity? Like, there are no easy answers, and it leaves us all grappling with these really tough questions.
It really makes you think. And it's not just like elite level competitions like the NCAA championship.
Right.
This debate impacts everything from youth sports, school policies, to like how we talk about gender in our society.
Absolutely, yeah.
Uh-huh.
And that's what makes this case so fascinating and so important, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, it forces us to confront these like fundamental questions about like, what is fairness?
Right.
What does inclusion mean? And, how do we create a society where everyone feels respected and valued?
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, we've kind of laid out the battlefield here, so to speak. Where do we go from here? How do we even start to like bridge this divide and find some common ground? What do you think?
Well, I think that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And I think the first step is recognizing that there's no like one-size-fits-all answer here.
It's not a simple equation with a neat solution.
Yeah.
We have to acknowledge the complexity of the issue.
Yeah.
And we have to respect the validity of these different viewpoints.
I hear you, but it's like it's hard not to feel frustrated. Like everyone in that hearing was so like locked into their own perspective that it felt like they were talking past each other.
Right.
There was very little common ground and definitely no clear path forward.
Right. And that's what makes this conversation so hard. We're dealing with deeply held beliefs. We're dealing with scientific data. We're dealing with individual rights. It's like trying to solve a puzzle where the pieces keep changing shape.
Right.
You
So how do we even like start to untangle this knot? Where do we go from here?
Well, one approach that's like gaining some traction is this idea of expanding the conversation beyond this like strict male-female binary.
Okay.
Remember Mosier mentioned intersex individuals? They kind of represent this like naturally occurring variation in sex characteristics that challenges that traditional understanding of male and female.
Right, and the senators don't really seem to know how to respond to that.
Right.
Like, how does that even play into this,
Well, for some people, the existence of intersex individuals kind of throws a wrench into that argument that sex is purely binary and easily determined, right?
Yeah.
It suggests that there's this more complex spectrum.
Right.
Which some people argue could inform a more nuanced approach to, like, transgender athlete participation.
That's really interesting. It makes you wonder if we need to, like, completely rethink our system of categorization, not just in sports, but, like, in other areas of life.
Yeah. Some experts are proposing these like alternative models for sports categorization.
Mm.
Instead of basing it just on biological sex, they suggest looking at factors like hormone levels, bone density, or even specific performance metrics.
So like a tiered system almost.
Exactly. That way, transgender athletes could compete against others with similar physical capabilities, regardless of their gender identity.
Right.
It could be a way to, like, address these fairness concerns while still promoting inclusion.
It sounds really complicated though. Like how do you even begin to like measure and categorize athletes in that way?
Yeah, it would be a very complex solution,
Right.
and there would be a lot of challenges to overcome, but some people would argue that the current system is already inherently unfair.
How so?
Well, even within the traditional, like, male-female binary, there's a huge range of physical capabilities.
Right.
You have tall people, short people, people with different muscle mass, varying levels of natural athletic talent.
Right.
So even in the current system, you can have athletes with significant physical advantages competing against others who are, like, naturally less equipped.
So you're saying that like even without considering transgender athletes, the playing field isn't perfectly level.
Exactly. And that's why some people say focusing only on biological sex as, like, the determining factor for these sports categories might be missing the bigger picture.
Okay.
They believe the goal should be to create a system that promotes fair competition based on a, like, broader range of physical characteristics.
That's a really interesting perspective. It definitely challenges the traditional way we think about sports and competition.
Mm.
But let's shift gears for a second and talk about like the impact this debate is having outside of like elite athletics. What are some of the like broader societal implications of this whole thing?
Well, for one thing, this whole controversy has spilled over into youth sports.
Mm.
We're seeing these debates in, like, school boards and state legislatures about transgender students participating in sports.
Right, and that feels even like more high stakes
Mhm.
because you're talking about kids.
Yeah,
You know, their sense of belonging, their self-esteem, like making the wrong decision there can have really lasting consequences.
absolutely. And it's not just about sports participation.
Yeah.
These debates often tie into these broader discussions about transgender rights, gender identity, and how we as a society understand and embrace diversity.
Yeah, it's like this issue has become a lightning rod for all of these really complex and often uncomfortable conversations.
Totally. It's pushing us to confront our own biases,
Yeah.
our assumptions about gender, and our understanding of fairness and inclusion.
So, given all of this complexity, what advice would you give to someone who's like trying to wrap their head around this issue? Where do you even begin?
I think the most important thing is to approach the issue with an open mind and a willingness to listen to different perspectives.
Right.
Don't just rely on headlines or sound bites.
Right.
Dig deeper, read firsthand accounts, and consider the ethical implications of these different solutions.
So, like, be informed and be empathetic.
Exactly. And it's also crucial to recognize that, like, language matters. This is a very sensitive topic, and the words we use can have a real impact on people's lives. So, let's be mindful of the language we choose. Avoid generalizations and focus on respectful dialogue.
That's such a good point. And I think it ties back to something we talked about earlier, like the need for like open and honest communication. If we're going to find a way forward, we have to be able to have these like hard conversations, but without resorting to like, name calling and attacking people.
Exactly. We need to create spaces where people feel safe to share their experiences, their fears, their hopes. And it's through those shared stories and that dialogue that we can start to build bridges of understanding.
That's a really nice thought. It makes me wonder, though, how we move beyond like just talking and understanding to actually finding solutions that work. Is that even possible?
That's the ultimate challenge, isn't it?
Yeah.
And, like, I don't think anyone has all the answers right now. But I do believe that if we can approach this with empathy, with open-mindedness, and a commitment to finding common ground, then we can create a more inclusive and equitable world for everybody.
Those are good words to live by. But before we get too idealistic, let's come back to the Leah Thomas case. What happened after that, like, contentious hearing? Did it lead to any, like, concrete changes in policy or approach?
Well, it's important to remember that the hearing itself wasn't about making specific policy decisions.
Right.
It was more about gathering information and perspectives. However, the case and the debate surrounding it definitely contributed to, like, this wave of legislative action across the country.
Right, like all these states are proposing and passing laws related to transgender athletes in sports.
Exactly. Some states have enacted laws banning transgender girls and women from competing in girls' and women's sports, citing concerns about fairness and biological advantages. Other states are taking a more inclusive approach, implementing policies that allow transgender athletes to participate in accordance with their gender identity.
So it seems like this debate is playing out not just in the court of public opinion, but also in legislatures across the nation. And it's creating this very, like, patchwork system of regulations.
That's right, and it's creating a lot of confusion and uncertainty for athletes, for coaches, for families.
Hmm.
We're also seeing legal challenges to some of these laws, so the legal landscape is constantly evolving.
It sounds like we're still a long way from finding, like, a real resolution, you know?
Probably true. But what's interesting is that this whole debate has spurred a lot of research and innovation. Scientists are studying the impact of gender-affirming hormone therapy on athletic performance.
Wow.
Sports governing bodies are exploring new ways to ensure fair competition while also promoting inclusion.
So while, like, the path forward might be super unclear, at least the conversation is moving forward.
I think so, yeah. We're learning more. We're challenging these old assumptions.
Right.
And we're working towards solutions that acknowledge the complexity of the issue. It's a messy process, but it's a necessary one if we want to create a world that's both fair and inclusive for all athletes.
That's a great point. It's not about having all the answers right now. It's about being willing to engage in this dialogue
Mm-hmm.
and adapt as we learn more.
Yeah.
So with that in mind, what's the most important thing you want our listeners to take away from this deep dive?
I think the key takeaway is that this issue is way more nuanced and complex than how it's often portrayed in the media.
Mhm.
It's not about simple binaries or easy solutions. It's about respecting the dignity and rights of all individuals
Mhm.
while also striving to create a level playing field.
So it's about, like, approaching it with empathy, critical thinking, and really trying to understand perspectives that are different from your own.
Exactly. And I think it's also important to remember that this debate isn't just about sports, right?
Yeah.
It's about how we define fairness and inclusion as a society.
Right?
It's about how we create a world where everyone feels valued and respected, regardless of their gender identity.
That's such a powerful message. It's about so much more than just, like, who wins the race. It's about creating a world where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
Beautifully put. And I think that's a perfect note to end on. We've covered a lot of ground today, but the conversation is far from over.
It really feels like we've only, like, scratched the surface here.
Yeah.
It's such a complicated issue, and it's clear that the Leah Thomas case is just, like, one tiny piece of this much larger debate, and there just aren't any easy answers. So
Yeah.
it's like, where do we even go from here? You know, how do we create a future that is both fair and inclusive for all athletes?
That's the million-dollar question,
Wow.
right? And I think it's important to remember this isn't just happening in courtrooms or legislative chambers.
Right.
Like, these conversations are happening everywhere, in living rooms, on social media, and those conversations, even though they can be hard, are so important.
Totally. It's easy to just, like, get caught up in the headlines and the, like, you know, the hot takes and everything.
Right.
But the real change happens when people are actually willing to sit down, have those conversations, and, like, really listen to each other.
Yeah, absolutely. And those conversations need to happen with respect and empathy, even when people disagree,
Yeah,
you know? Because we're talking about real people's lives and experiences here.
absolutely.
Transgender athletes deserve to be treated with dignity and respect,
Yeah.
just like any other athlete.
100%. And at the same time, we also need to acknowledge those concerns from, like, cisgender female athletes who are like, well, is this fair?
Right.
You know? So it's like finding that balance.
Exactly. And finding that balance is not going to be easy.
Yeah.
It's going to require, creativity, flexibility, and a willingness to consider solutions that maybe challenge like the traditional ways we thought about sports.
Yeah.
Maybe it means, exploring new categorization systems.
Mhm.
Maybe it means developing more nuanced ways to assess athletic performance that go beyond, simple biological markers.
It's like we need to completely rethink how we're even approaching this whole thing.
I think that's a great way to put it. We can't just rely on these old frameworks and assumptions. This issue demands new ways of thinking, new approaches, and this, commitment to dialogue and learning.
Yeah. It's almost like we're all on this journey of discovery together,
Mm-hmm.
trying to figure out how to create a more inclusive and equitable world for all athletes. And it's not going to happen overnight, right? It's going to be this long process with lots of, like, bumps in the road.
Totally. It's a great analogy. We're all learning and evolving as we go, and that's okay. The important thing is to keep the conversation going, keep listening to each other, and keep striving towards that future where all athletes have the opportunity to compete and thrive.
So for our listeners who might be like, this is too much, this is so complicated, what would you tell them? What's the one thing you want them to take away?
I would say stay curious, stay informed, stay engaged.
Hmm.
Don't be afraid to, ask questions, challenge assumptions, speak up for what you believe in. And, most importantly, remember that behind all the headlines and the debates are real people with real stories. So let's treat each other with kindness, respect, and a genuine desire to understand.
So well said. This deep dive has been a roller coaster, you know. We've been through it all, the information, the emotions, but I think it's important to end on a note of hope. Even though the path forward is like a little hazy, the fact that we're having these conversations, that we're challenging like all these old ideas and that we're actually looking for solutions means that we're like moving in the right direction.
I agree. Change is rarely easy or simple, but it's through these hard conversations and this commitment to, fairness and inclusion
Hmm.
that we're going to create a better future for everyone.
So to all of you listening out there, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep those conversations going. I think the future of sports and maybe even society depends on it.